Hello there, welcome to the Saroy channel and welcome to my omnibus series. I've got so many of these omnibuses that are going to come out so that you'll be able to listen to an hour's worth of stories, which I know you're going to love. You know, the thing is that telling stories is such a fine art, and it's something that was practiced hundreds of years ago when people didn't have the technology that we have today. And everyone would gather around the fire and listen to a wonderful story. And also, what is so wonderful about a story is that personally, I think it is the best way to go to sleep. Every night when I go to bed, I always listen to stories. And that's something that parents used to do with their children. It's something that they still do with their children. There's nothing better than a good story. And so I hope you're going to enjoy this series. And before we start, I just want to say, do subscribe to my channel because you don't want to miss out on anything. Because I'm in for the long haul and I want to make sure that you get the most stunning stories to go to bed with at night or to listen to when you want to be one of those people sitting beside the fire and listening. Don't forget to subscribe to my channel and let's get started. I hope you're going to enjoy the omnibus.
Dear Sarah and all your lovely listeners, my name is Nicole and I'm from a very quaint rural area in North America. But if I give the precise details where I live, everyone will know who I am, or at least the people that know me will. It is for this reason that I would like to remain anonymous, because there are a few wagging tongues in our small town which goes with the territory of living in places like this, and I don't want to be an object of scandal. I live in an idyllic, spacious bungalow that my father built in the early 60s, and it has remained in our family since then. We also have a few outbuildings on our land. At the time, my father purchased the land for next to nothing because prices in those days are not what they're like today, so I'm so thankful to live in a place as beautiful as this. Every morning I get up and look at those enchanting views outside the kitchen window, and I never grow tired of what I see. We are surrounded by the most glorious mountain valleys, wherever you look, and large areas of natural forest that go on for an eternity. We also have beautiful streams running through our land on the right-hand side of the valley, adjacent to the woods. This has to be my favourite spot in the entire world. We even built a little watch house there so we can sit and watch the wildlife on very comfortable seats. My husband is crazy about birds, so he can hang out in that little watch house for hours on end, and he has documented some of the most unusual birds to date, and some of those sightings have been of very rare birds that have visited our land. It goes without saying that there are lots and lots of wild animals on our land. At one stage we had a problem with too many wild hogs rummaging around the place, causing no end of damage to the natural vegetation. Funnily enough, even without the culling, the population suddenly decreased, which we became very thankful for. At the time of the decrease in our hog population, we did suddenly notice that we were hearing whooping sounds all over our land, which my husband said sounded like primate calls. We did, however, know that this could not be the case, because North America does not have an indigenous ape species. There were also times we would hear a strange howling sound from the woods, which was a sound that we simply could not identify and was a big mystery to us. It was a sound that would leave you feeling exceedingly rattled because it sounded more supernatural than natural. All these strange nightly calls did lead us to believe that there had to be something going on in the woods that was not of this world. Every morning my husband and I would rise early to go to work. We both had jobs in the local town. My husband is the town butcher, and I run my own clothes boutique that has been doing very well for many years because the clothes are pretty special and not the usual run-of-the-mill stuff. At the time of my Bigfoot encounter, I had a little 3-year-old girl that needed taking care of while I was out working. My next-door neighbour would always look after my child, and I paid her handsomely for the job. However, on this occasion, my neighbour, who I will call Shirley, had developed a really bad bout of flu and was relegated to her bed by the strict instructions of her doctor. But she did beg me to let me use Liesel, who was her 16-year-old daughter, to take care of my child instead. I knew Liesel to be a very responsible, reliable teenager. You could trust her almost with anything. I did not know at the time that she suffered from epilepsy, but her fits were few and far between, and she hadn't had one for about 9 months. So even if I had known about them at the time, I possibly would still have let her take care of my kid, provided she stayed indoors, of course, just to be safe. Liesel was very excited to look after little Daisy, my daughter, and she was going to take her for a walk in the afternoon to the stream. We can play there together and watch the birds and maybe see some deer going and having a drink. It'll be so fun, she said. As long as she doesn't go into the water, I warned her. You really must be careful and keep your eyes on her at all times. At this point, Liesel will share her story and exactly what happened while she was looking after Daisy, because obviously I wasn't there at the time. Well, I was excited to be looking after Daisy because I just love kids, and Daisy's one of the cutest kids I know. At first we spent most of the day indoors, doing finger painting and making cookies in the kitchen. Daisy loves chocolate chip cookies, so that's what we made. In the afternoon, at about 3:30 p.m, I took her on the buggy towards the stream, and we played there for a while. We threw little pebbles into the water, and then we watched the birds, and there were also a couple of white-tailed deer that came to the water to drink, and Daisy was intrigued because they were so pretty. Suddenly they all just scattered, all the deer I mean, as if a predator was around, and they looked very afraid and very alarmed. I remember I smelt a really nasty stench, and then I saw this big humanoid hairy creature covered all over with blackish-brown hair with hints of red and auburn in it. It was like the biggest man I'd ever seen, only it was female because it had small firm breasts. I could see that the head was very cone-shaped and the shoulders were very huge, and the creature had no neck to speak of and very long arms and long legs. I think she could have easily been 7 foot tall and maybe weighed about 600 pounds. Put it this way, she was too big to be human, and she did have an ape-like look to her, on her face I mean. When the creature glanced over in our direction and saw me, with little Daisy, she looked exceedingly surprised. I'm not sure she was happy to be spotted by us, but she did stare for a moment. I truly was so terrified, and I was shaking like a jelly. I really thought this thing was going to kill us. It was like being face to face with a terrible tiger or some other dangerous creature, equally as frightening. I think the terror that this creature instilled in me brought on my epileptic fit, because I suddenly started fitting all over the ground, and then I just blanked out for a while. It was all very surreal. Now back to my story. While all this was happening at the stream, I returned home at about 5 p.m. from the shop to see that there was no sign of Liesel or my daughter Daisy, and I was worried sick because I didn't know what had happened to them. It was not like Liesel to be so late. When I spoke to Shirley, her mother, on the phone, I did ask what could possibly have gone wrong. She did admit to me that her daughter did suffer from epileptic fits, and I was horrified because this was news to me and was something I wasn't informed about. It was a mother's worst nightmare, because if my 3-year-old was running around unsupervised, she could get herself in all kinds of trouble. I'd never been so terrified in all my life, as I had the most terrible visions of Daisy's lifeless body floating down the stream from a drowning accident, because I knew that that was where they had gone that afternoon. I tore down to the stream area of our property and was met with total silence. Everything was so quiet you could have heard a pin drop. There was no bug calls, no bird song at all. It was dead as a dodo. Suddenly I saw Daisy's jersey floating down the stream, and my worst fears were realised. I felt utterly devastated. I felt as if my whole world had collapsed, and I just felt totally empty. I just sat on the ground, sobbing and sobbing and sobbing. I looked up to find Liesel standing by my side. "What happened?" she asked, looking bemused. I looked at her in utter horror. "You tell me," I said. "What on earth have you done with Daisy?" At that moment I could hear the familiar squeak of Daisy's buggy coming towards me, and it was what was pushing the buggy that put the fear of God into my whole being. It was a humanoid ape, covered in black hair, who looked at me with a gentle, understanding eyes, and she parked the buggy yards away from me, nodded, and disappeared into the forest with such grace and huge speed. Little Daisy came running into my arms shouting, "Mummy, Mummy, Mummy!" And I cradled her and just burst into tears. I could definitely sense something was watching me from the tree line, and I imagine it was that female creature. "Did you see that thing?" I looked at Liesel in horror. "What on earth was it? And why was it pushing Daisy's buggy?" Liesel looked at me, and her face went as white as a sheet. "I think that creature was looking after Daisy," she said, "when I blacked out with my epileptic fit. Do you know, I woke up after my seizure on the ground here, and I found myself in the watch house. So I didn't get there on my own. Something put me there, and I think it was the creature." "You do? Well, there's no other explanation, is there? I think that creature carried me to safety and was also looking after Daisy until a human showed up to get her. I think she was waiting for you. That's why she suddenly brought the buggy over to you." I was stunned. I had heard of animals rescuing humans before, but this was different. My little Daisy could have drowned if it was not for this creature. I went home and did some research about the creature, and I believe I encountered a maternal Bigfoot whose natural instinct was to keep my child safe. So whatever you might say about the creatures, I do know that there are some specimens out there that are incredibly compassionate and caring. I have now connected the dots and know that those whooping sounds came from those creatures, and I think they have cowed a lot of the destructive hog in my area. So they've done an awful lot of good as far as I'm concerned. I was so grateful to the female Bigfoot for taking care of my little girl Daisy, and so on a shopping trip to Walmart, I brought the creature some presents that I left in the woods for her in a very large basket, which I hope she received. I brought her raisins, prunes, walnuts, cashews, apples, pears, strawberries, and the list goes on, including a lovely thick warm blanket. Not that it might not have any use to her, but I thought it could be of help. 2 days later I found a deerskin on my doorstep, filled with smooth pebbles, and I believe that they were a gift from the Bigfoot. So I will always treasure them as long as I live, and I have such warm feelings towards the creature. So there you are, that's my story. Is Mothman a harbinger of doom? If you hear a violent, thunderous flapping sound from a hefty, heavy wingspan, and you just happen to glance up into the dark sky for a second on a moonless night, you may just see him. He is a creature like no other. Some say a messenger of evil tidings, a harbinger of doom, or an angel of death. And over half a century, there have been many recorded sightings of this menacing and flying humanoid. Indeed, all around the globe, there have been strange sightings of flying humanoids everywhere. And these strange sightings appear to be on the increase. The question is, what or who are they, and where or what do they come from? There is one that is well known by now, and he is called the Mothman, and he soars the skies like a gigantic flying humanoid, seeking who he can devour and destroy from a very vast height. No one is safe under the foreboding, menacing glare of those steely red eyes that miss nothing and see absolutely everything. He stands at 6 to 9 feet tall, an imposing creature with monstrously huge black feathery wings, a low-slung head, and huge red eyes that are seemingly not of this world. Indeed, this predatory creature was seen by many horrified witnesses around the same time, or even before, the most disastrous Silver Bridge collapse West Virginia has ever witnessed in the town of Mount Pleasant. The majestic bridge stood proud, gracing the Ohio River, until 5 p.m. on the 15th of December 1967, and then it crumbled apart like a heap of Lego blocks and fell into bits and pieces into the murky depths of this river, throwing its victims into its watery grave of freezing cold temperatures. It was declared that this 1928 bridge was structurally flawed, which was why it had succumbed to such a deadly fate, devouring mercilessly over 40 wasted lives. Yet others believed that Mothman was directly implicated in this dreadful disaster and had something to do with it, that almost affected the entire town with a huge veil of grief, while others say that it was a sign witnessed by many of the impending doom that was to come, that ultimately led to the tragic Silver Bridge collapse. My story happened in the February of 1967, when my sister Beatrice and I went to stay with my aunt in Point Pleasant. We were very excited by the visit, and people at that time were still talking about the mysterious Silver Bridge collapse. My aunt had lost a good friend in the disaster, and she was still grieving her untimely demise. When we arrived at her quaint little cottage, we received a rapturous welcome from our warm and wonderful aunt. She was so thrilled to see us and brought all our luggage in and led us into a beautiful, large, airy and spacious bedroom where we were to stay, which was decorated in warm yellows and whites and was so uplifting it reminded us of a bright summer's day, something that we needed in the middle of winter. I sat at my aunt's kitchen table, sipping hot coffee and eating her delicious homemade pumpkin pie with lashings of thick, fresh cream. And then I proceeded to ask her all about the bridge collapse that had occurred a couple of months earlier and was still a hot topic of conversation among all the townsfolk in the area who still clearly suffered the post-traumatic ramifications of that disaster. "Well, it was rush hour, you know," said my aunt, chewing a mouthful of pumpkin pie thoughtfully. "It was bumper-to-bumper traffic on that day. Oh, it couldn't have been a worse time of day for sure, for anything to happen. And just in seconds, that bridge just crumbled like that. When I watched it on the television, I couldn't believe what I was seeing. Everyone in town has been affected in some way, because it's a small town, and most of us know each other, or know of someone who was tragically killed on that bridge. I believe that water was iced over on that day. I'm not sure about it, but I think it was. So can you imagine how cold it must have been?" "Tell us about your friend," I asked, "the one who you lost in the tragedy." "Oh, what a lovely woman. Oh, she had the heart of a lion. She would have given you her shoe and her shirt off her back. She was my very best friend. We told each other absolutely everything, kept no secrets from each other at all. I'm still struggling to come to terms with her death because it seems so pointless, so unfair, and so crazy that this whole thing actually happened." I saw my aunt wiping away some tears from her face. "Sorry, I just get emotional talking about all this stuff. Oh, I just think it hits a raw nerve, you know." "Of course it does," I said, stroking my aunt's arm reassuringly. "You weren't to know this tragedy would happen. It wasn't your fault. None of us would have known that this was going to happen." My aunt looked at me with a grave expression written on her face. I should have listened when my friend told me about her terrifying dream. I just took it all like a pinch of salt, and I told her not to worry, because dreams are just dreams and nothing else. That's what I thought. And now, of course, I really regret that. "What dream?" I asked. My friend dreamt very vividly, and she dreamt about this monstrously huge humanoid-like creature. She told me it had a massive wingspan and bright red, huge compound eyes. And she said it was so real, she was not actually sure if she dreamt it or she actually saw it. She said that the dream was so real that she could have almost touched the creature, and that this bird-like being just literally floated above her body while she slept. How horrible, I gasped. The creature she described sounds like the Mothman. You think she saw him? My aunt nodded. Oh, yes, I do. And I think it was a harbinger of doom, I really do. A bearer of very bad news. And many people witnessed this flying humanoid before the bridge collapsed in Point Pleasant. I heard a lot of people talking all about it. There were so many sightings of the thing. Well, that's what I heard. So what did your friend that died say about the Mothman that she actually saw in her dream? Well, she came to me. Oh, I remember that day. Oh, it was a terrible day. And she was in a dreadful panic. Oh, she was convinced she was going to die. She was so frantic about it. She said she had this gut-wrenching sense of knowing that something quite dreadful was going to happen to her. She said that even a year before her dream, she had this foreboding feeling and heavy impression of her future. But after the visitation from this winged humanoid with the fiery red eyes, she was almost certain that the days of her life on this earth were numbered. She was convinced that this creature had come to tell her that her life was about to end very shortly. And we know that it did. It must have been a dreadful death, said my aunt, looking desperately sad. Oh, poor thing. All I can say is I just hope it was quick. I'm sure it was, I said, trying to be reassuring. I wonder, I said, if other people who died on that bridge may have had similar dreams. You know, it's not something you would necessarily share with someone. If I had a dream like that, I know I wouldn't share it with anyone, would you? Oh, I agree. You know, we all have this inbuilt fear of death, said my aunt. And so it's natural to shrug off any gloomy thoughts that we might have and dismiss them out of hand as vain imaginings. Yes, I think if I had a visitation from a creature like that in my dreams, yes, I would be terrified to share it with someone. It would be like I was tempting fate in some way. The subject of Mothman was luckily soon forgotten, as my sister scurried around preparing herself for a date that she had accepted with a local boy from Point Pleasant, who had met her at the grocery store earlier in the day and asked her out. I could sense her excitement because she said she felt an instant attraction to the boy, and it was a long time since she had felt that way about anyone. I reluctantly decided to retire to bed early that night. I was exhausted after the long conversation and intense discussion about the Mothman and all about the Silver Bridge collapse. It left a horrible taste in my mouth, and I couldn't help wondering and hoping that tomorrow's conversations would be of a lighter variety and more cheerful and uplifting. Suddenly I found myself, after dozing off, being shaken violently by my sister, and I was not happy to be woken up like this. After all, I was in the middle of a really lovely dream, and I didn't want to stop dreaming, but my sister's continuous shaking of my body persisted. "Wake up! Wake up! Wake up!" she said, shaking me up. I sat bolt upright on my bed, looking at my sister in alarm. "What on earth is wrong?" I asked. "Why are you shaking me like this? You look like you've seen a ghost. Are you all right?" "I'm going to die," she said. There was a silence for a moment, and then she repeated it. "Did you hear what I said? I'm going to die, and very soon." "What?" I said. "What on earth are you talking about? Of course you're not going to die. Where did you get that crazy idea from?" "I saw him," said my sister. "I saw the Mothman tonight. I saw the harbinger of doom, the bearer of bad tidings, the angel of death. And he stared at me with those big red horrible eyes of his." "What? Are you sure?" I asked. "I'm as sure can be," said my sister, tears pouring down her face. "I know what I saw, and I knew what it meant, and I don't know what to do." My sister started to sob violently, as I took her into my arms and consoled her. Just because you saw him does not mean you're going to die. I'm sure a lot of people have seen him and they haven't died. Tell me, what did you see? Well, I don't know the area around here very well, as you know, but we were driving. I think William was calling it the TMT area. It was past the power plant building there, and suddenly we saw this huge humanoid creature, and it had long, black, feathery wings. They were horrible, and huge red eyes, the biggest that I've ever seen. Well, William accelerated the car, and we literally speeded up as fast as we could, and so did the creature. It was flying alongside us at 100 miles an hour, and it was looking in at us with these horrible, evil, red, ugly eyes. It had a hypnotic effect on us, and we were so frightened. I was screaming for William to drive faster and faster, but he was going as fast as he possibly could. He kept his foot down hard on the accelerator, and we were driving fast as conceivably possible. The creature followed us all the way to the town, and then we heard a thrashing and a pounding and a beating on our car roof as those wings flapped and banged against it with such a powerful force that they actually dented the roof of William's car. Oh, it's going to cost a lot to repair. You should have seen the indentation. It was huge, and that thing was mighty heavy. A couple of onlookers in the town, when they saw this thing standing there on the roof, like a menacing gargoyle, I watched them. They ran away screaming as fast as they could at the top of their lungs. I've never seen people look so afraid in all of my life. Did the creature follow you here? I asked more seriously. My sister nodded, looking sheepish. Well, when William parked the car here and he dropped me off, we were pretty much convinced that the creature had finally flown away. At least we hoped we had, and it looked like it had, so we were relieved. I told William to go quickly in case this thing suddenly came back and attached itself to his car. I watched him drive off, and then I let myself in through the front door, and then I heard a crashing sound on the picket fence, and lo and behold, there it was again, staring at me and swinging backwards and forwards on the fence like it was taunting me. It followed me here, and it's still out there. What does it want with me? She asked me in terror. Is it still there? I asked, getting off my bed and running over to the kitchen window that overlooked our aunt's picket fence. The outside light illuminated the whole area very brightly, and there it was. I saw the formidable presence standing on the picket fence. It was the largest winged creature that I have ever seen in my entire life, and it seemed to be covered with silvery black down. But it was the red, menacing, compound-shaped eyes that stared right through me that set my nerves on edge. My heart was pounding violently like a heavy drum, and I could feel it throbbing through my chest. My whole body seemed to break out into a cold sweat, and I started shivering as if I was in Arctic conditions, but my aunt's house was exceedingly warm that day. Even my teeth were rattling in my mouth as my whole body simply wobbled like a jelly. The creature looked at me directly with intense red eyes and held my gaze, and I could physically not turn away from that physical hold it had over me. It felt like electricity was going right through my body. The creature seemed to smirk at me like he was toying at me and enjoying my paralyzing fear, as if it was some kind of enjoyable game for him. Suddenly before our eyes, the creature seemed to fade away until it was finally gone, just like a ghost. You see that? The creature is supernatural, said my sister. It vanished before our very eyes. Now that's not a natural phenomenon. This creature is not of this world, and that is for sure. I was utterly terrified. I had never physically witnessed something like this before, and I was almost certain that whatever this thing was, it was supernatural. The next morning we told our aunt what had happened, and she said that something needed to be done immediately to stop us from succumbing to a deadly fate. If we do not do something now, you are both going to end up in serious trouble, or worse still, you could end up like my friend, and I cannot allow that to happen to either of you. I've lost too much already, and I'm not losing you both as well. My aunt piled us in the back of her car, and we drove for an hour and a half, away from the Mount Pleasant area. I'm not sure exactly where we were. I watched my aunt veer off a main road and turn down a very wide dirt road, and then she took a left-hand turning up a spirally narrow path that looked way too small for a car to venture down. It was very hard for her to navigate the vehicle without edging over into the grassy curb, but somehow she managed. Finally, the car reached an enormous black metal gate that was wide open. We drove down the long gravel pathway towards a pretty white house with large open French windows that were very big. Terracotta pots full of colourful cascading blooms greeted us, and the grass that was mown was manicured to perfection. A lady with a merry heart-shaped face, curious brown eyes, and long hazel hair tied back in a ponytail, greeted us both warmly. She was wearing a loose white pair of flowing cotton pants and a matching top, and she had an artsy look about her. My aunt exclaimed what had happened to us during the night, and how this entity we had seen could pose a dreadful impending threat over our lives. "Is there any way that we can reverse this damage?" my aunt asked anxiously. "I'm so afraid my two nieces may be in serious danger of something terrible happening to them." "Well, there is something we can do," said the lady. "First of all, we need to remove any negative attachments, entities and implants. We need to cleanse the auric field and the energy field. And once that's cleared, they will be fine. You see, if the negative energy is not drained away, it can invite perilous consequences. So removal of spiritual sucking leeches or parasites from the life force is imperative. And you will be surprised how many we gather over a lifetime. I'd also like to unblock all the 7 chakras to bring balance and healing to the body." We were directed into a very spacious, airy room and asked to lie back on these long cotton mattresses on the wooden floor. We watched the woman fill the room with clouds of smoke, which she smudged over our bodies with these thick cigar-shaped incense sticks. She then started to rattle strange instruments around us, and even played the Tibetan bowls and other instruments with different frequencies, which she said would release all the negative attachments to our bodies. She said to us that these attachments did not like those frequencies. I know this sounds crazy, and I don't know how to explain it to you, but I promise you, as weird as this may sound, I could feel heavy energies lifting and leaving my body, like a cloud of heavy fog, and after a while we heard the loud flapping sound of heavy wings leaving the room, and those wings, my sister told me later, sounded like the wings of the Mothman that were on her roof the night before. Suddenly everything was very still and quiet, and I could see the lady who had been doing the clearing suddenly looking utterly and totally exhausted. "This is the worst energy clearing I have ever done," she said. "Your negative attachment was enormously strong. It was forceful and very resistant. But he's gone. He's finally gone from you." I later learnt from my aunt that she had actually seen a demonic, monstrous form in a smoky haze leaving the house at the same time of the clearing. Whether it was Mothman, I do not know, but we definitely heard the wings of the creature during our session, so I'm pretty sure he finally left us. 2 days after our clearing, we felt so much better, so much lighter, so much healthier, and so much more positive. And then we heard the terrible news about William, my sister's date, who had actually seen the Mothman while driving through the TMT area, and was now found mysteriously floating head down and lifeless in his neighbour's pond, which was all very peculiar. According to the neighbours, he had never once visited their house before, so why he was found there and died in that way was very uncanny and extraordinarily unusual. I also learnt that he was a phenomenal swimmer. It would seem that bizarre and unusual deaths are connected to this mystical Mothman creature. So there you are. That is my story. What Mothman is, I do not know. Some say he's a result of a government experiment gone hideously wrong. Some say he's a mutant monster, a space alien, a demonic interdimensional being, a fallen angel, or an angel of death. I do not know what he is, but I do know he is physical and he is supernatural, both at the same time. And one thing I know certain, for very much certain, this thing is real, and for your sake, I hope he will never cross your path.
Dear Sarah and all your listeners, I'm writing to tell you all about the bayou swamp monster, which is a Bigfoot-like creature that lives in New Orleans, Louisiana. It chooses to remain elusive and seemingly invisible in the swamp or wetlands and areas of bayou. These are Pacific areas of flat land with stagnant, opaque water. This mysterious creature has been sighted on many occasions by a few of the Creole locals who prefer not to talk about their experience with this hairy humanoid beast. The bayou swamp monster is different in its descriptions that you hear of the traditional American Bigfoot, as described so often in documented testimonials. It seems that the bayou swamp monster has adapted both biologically and physically to the marsh-like environment that it inhabits. Many traditional Bigfoots appear to have wider 16-inch feet when fully grown, whereas this creature has a narrower foot, equally as large in length, but narrower in width, with 3 clear toe imprints that appear to be webbed between each toe. I was to learn about this strange creature from an old Creole Cajun friend of mine who grew up in the 50s and has sadly subsequently passed away. He was a very special person. He shared with me so many stories of his life growing up around the marshy wetlands, many areas that can only be accessed by boat or canoe. He was to share with me some of the extraordinary experiences he had growing up in this vast area of marshy wilderness. He also revealed to me some of his mysterious, unexplainable encounters that frequented his life growing up in Louisiana. So this is the story that he shared with me over 30 long years ago, in his own words, as I so vividly recall. I was 12 years old at the time, with an unrivaled and unbridled spirit of adventure and passion. I was to learn from a young age how to navigate a boat, because there is no earthly way to get through this impenetrable marshland without one. Sometimes using a boat, especially if the water is shallow in parts, can present a real challenge due to all the marshy plants and bulbous knotty roots that dwell beneath the watery surfaces. These gloriously beautiful, exquisite wetlands, with their vast circles of pretty green algae carpeting the water in thick veils of moss, like beautiful fabric, are just wonderful to behold. Then there are the beautiful water lily-like plants, including the May plant, with its pretty white flowers that rises above the surface, creating an artistic palette of beauty. Let's not forget the trees that grace the watery landscape, with boughs laden with beautiful green leaves that skim over the silvery surface like creeping willows, making the wetlands a picturesque sight to behold. Better still, the marshes are teeming with vibrant animal life, such as otters, muskrats, beavers, catfish, turtles, and alligators. And then there are also deer living there, wild pig, possums, and armadillos. As a young boy, I loved and adored it all, and spent most of my time fishing as well as exploring the wetlands. One day I smelt this disgusting wet dog-like smell that was so pungent and odorous. I went to investigate where it was coming from because I was always curious by nature. As I explored the wetland, I came across all these cypress branches that were piled on top of each other
with layers of Spanish moss in between, and I realized that something was using this technique to cover up a huge half-eaten carcass of a hog. I could not imagine what animal could have buried its prize like this, because this was done on drier land, so something heavy and clearly bipedal was lifting up those branches and stacking them on top of each other, and there was no animal living in the marshes capable of this kind of behaviour that I knew of. I always studied the animal scat and foot markings around the bayou. My Creole Cajun friends would tell me that I was born to be a tracker, because I knew what every animal marking was and how recently the animal had been in the territory. I came across 3 narrow big footprints that were 15 inches long, with 3 digits or toes, and between each digit it was webbed like a duck. It was then I knew with a certainty that I wanted to find out what this mystery bipedal creature was with the webbed feet. I visited the area very regularly to see if I could locate this mystery creature, but I did not see anything for a long time, until one day I smelt the strange smell again. I heard the rustling sound that sounded like there was a struggle that was going on between a hefty creature of some kind. So I crept towards it to see what was going on, and then I saw it. It was this huge, monstrous, hairy, ape-like humanoid creature wrestling an American alligator, and the alligator was losing this ferocious battle. Do you realize how strong you have to be to take down a large alligator? Well, I assure you this monstrously big bipedal creature had no problems in killing this alligator at all, which was no match for him. I saw it sitting on this alligator with its huge muscular buttocks in a very low squatting stance, putting his full body weight on the reptilian body, and with his massive hands and sausage-like fingers, he immobilized, dislocated, and broke the jaw, and seemingly suffocated the creature. Until that moment, I had thought and assumed that the most dangerous predator in the bayou was the American alligator, whose only other foe was another alligator like himself. But clearly I was wrong. On this occasion, I only saw the back of the creature, but he was about 9 to 1,000 pounds and 10 feet tall. He was covered in grey hair all over his body, and the back of his head looked like a mass of messy hair. Also, this thing stank to high heaven and had a musky, skunk-like odour. I was grateful it did not turn around to see me watching it, because I knew that uncanny display of violent strength that I had just seen, that this thing was incredibly dangerous. He had a very powerful presence about him, and I guarantee that there wasn't an animal on the bayou that wasn't terrified and intimidated by him. I watched the bayou swamp monster dragging the dead alligator with one hand across the moist ground, and I knew at once what he was doing, and I knew what he would be dining on that night. After the encounter, I was terrified of this monstrous hairy beast, and I made sure that I always carried a rifle with me at all times, every time I ventured out on my boat. Despite my terrible fear, I was still incredibly fascinated by this thing, and told my father what I had seen. I thought my father would dismiss my account and laugh at me, but in our culture and living around the swampland, many of our people have seen strange things that they could never explain. There are also reports of supernatural encounters and ghostly sightings, because New Orleans has quite a rich, vibrant history behind it. My father encouraged me to go and visit his friend who had an encounter with the bayou swamp monster. When I spoke to his friend and told him about this creature killing an alligator, it was not a surprise to him at all. He said one time that he was out in his boat, he saw the bayou swamp monster swimming in the water and witnessed its humanoid head bobbing up and down like a person swimming breaststroke. He said at first he was so shocked and he thought it was a massive humanoid otter, because this creature swam with such effortless grace and agility. He watched the creature crossing to the other side of the swamp, and he had the shock of his life as he witnessed the creature climb out of the water and rising to the surface like a monstrous giant. It started to shake its coat like a shaggy dog, raining down large droplets of water all over the ground. He said this thing was monstrously huge. He was so paralyzed and immobilized by fear, and the creature just turned around and held his gaze for a moment with these dark, soulless eyes. And he said he had never been so shaken up by anything in his entire life. Then the bayou monster opened his mouth and wailed like a howling wind that sounded eerily supernatural. He said he was so freaked out by the experience that he suffered anxiety attacks for months after the event, and it was a long time before he ventured out onto the swamp again. And when he did, he was always accompanied. I did ask many of the local people at the time if they had heard any wailing sounds or seen any sightings of the bayou swamp monster. Most were reluctant to share their stories with me, but judging by the frightened looks on their faces, they told me all I needed to know, and that some of these people had indeed had sightings of this hairy, humanoid, elusive beast. It was clear that they would rather not share their stories with me, least of all a busybody like myself, asking all kinds of awkward questions. One very grey-haired, haggard-looking fisherman, whose leathery skin had seen way too much sun, told me that he had also seen the beast, when one day in his boat he nearly ran directly into the strange creature swimming in the swamp that was so agile in the water that it swam as beautifully as an otter. He saw this huge elongated head rising above the water like a human head, with a crinkly wet hairstyle surrounding its face that looked like a human perm. This thing, whatever it was, swam towards him and started to shake his boat very aggressively. He was almost certain the creature was either trying to scare him or capsize his boat, and he said everything in the boat was vibrating and shaking. In a moment, a couple of his large dead fish bounced off the floor of the boat and landed in the water, and the creature seized them with his huge hairy humanoid hands that were massive in width and size. I've never ever seen such a massive hand in my whole life, he told me in horrid recall. The fingers were so big they were like sausages. The creature swam away with my dead catfish, but that was a small price to pay to see the back of him. If I never see the monster again, it will be too soon, that I can assure you. My fascination about this strange bipedal beast grew and grew, and I spent many long hours on the bayou seeking out this creature. I have never known something so elusive and difficult to find as the swamp monster, but my determination for an encounter with him finally paid off, but on a day when I was least expecting it. It was on a Sunday morning, and I was on my boat watching the area of bayou close to where I believe this creature hunted and stalked its prey, and possibly even nested. The first thing I noticed was a skunk-like wet dog smell, and then I knew he was around, and my senses were alerted. I suddenly felt uneasy, and I got the distinct impression that something was watching me. I could feel these steely, hostile eyes on me that were both intimidating and exceedingly menacing. I was not going to allow the overwhelming, paralyzing fear I was experiencing to rob me of an encounter with the beast. My impression was that this creature uses his provocative, hostile presence as a powerful tool to terrify his prey. The prey inevitably becomes immobilized by fear and ends up as a sitting duck for this predator, ensuring an easy kill. After all, most creatures like an effortless hunt that requires very little energy consumption, and being that this creature is seemingly highly intelligent, he will invariably use every tool in his box to his advantage, just like a human would. I just stood on my boat, staring out over the wetland, refusing to be afraid of this thing. And then I heard that horrible wailing sound that sounded like a howling, creepy windstorm. It was so awful it had the hair at the back of my neck standing on end. I wondered whether the sound was also another tool that this creature was using to intimidate me, because believe me, it was working. I could see all the ducks and waterfowl on the bayou flying away swiftly when they heard the ghostly wails, and it seemed like all signs of animal life had but fleeted. I saw a couple of alligators who had been happily sunbathing on the side of the bayou making a hasty retreat back into the water, and even a large eagle who had been perching on a cypress tree branch, scanning the water for a potential fish dinner, took off and flew away with its powerful wings. It seemed like the whole swamp had become eerily quiet and still, so much so that the beautiful atmosphere was now replaced by a menacing, cold, unfriendly ambience. Was the creature trying to lure me away with his wails, I wondered? Anyone who heard this creature wailing was totally terrified of the thing and would always flee, and that is exactly what this creature wanted me to do. But that was not going to happen, because I could see through his crafty tricks. I stood my ground and stayed on my boat, waiting for this creature to show itself, and then it did. And believe me, I did not really believe it would happen, because this creature is secretive and elusive and hates to be seen, especially by humans. He would rather that humans remain oblivious to his existence. This huge, monstrous, elusive creature stood there larger than life, staring at me with enraged brown eyes, and he let out the most terrible low guttural growl, curling back his lips to reveal a set of monstrously huge human-like teeth. The creature's hair around its face was a mass of messy curls that almost looked like a full afro hairstyle. The face was so human-looking, with brown eyes wider apart than a human being, and a very flat, big nose, and a huge mouth with thin lips, and the body was just a mass of grey long hair that looked tangled, matted, muddy, and full of green Spanish moss that was weaving its roots through the creature's hair, so he rarely blended into his environment almost with perfection. It was like he was a walking ghillie suit. The only thing that would give him away to his predators was the smell that was always evident when he was around. The creature started waving his fists at me angrily, and then he made a mock charge towards my boat, and I decided to go as quickly as I could. I had seen all I needed to see, and I was thrilled. I now knew that the bayou monster was indeed real. Were there others, I wondered? There had to be. But these creatures knew how to conceal themselves and blend into their environments with flawless perfection. I was in no doubt that if anybody had a random sighting of the creature, they would never be sure of what they had actually seen, and they would wonder if it was a possible trick of the light or their mind playing tricks with them. Nowadays, if you go to New Orleans, Louisiana, I do recommend you take a wonderful airboat ride through the marshy swamps, which is so beautiful to behold. But I can promise you this, you will see alligators and other animals, but I guarantee you few will get to see the bayou swamp monster, because even though he is around, he definitely does not want you to see him. Dear Sarah, and all your lovely listeners, my name is Olga, and on my father's side of the family, we're all previously from Russia, and I want to assure you that not every Russian woman is trying to snag an American man for herself, which is just one of those awful stereotypes that doesn't carry much weight, and that most Russians absolutely hate. Although let's face it, who in their right mind wouldn't want a green card? America and Canada are the most stunningly beautiful countries in the entire world, but then I am exceedingly biased because I am half American. My mother, for example, is a fully fledged American Southern belle who met my father when he was working for the American Embassy out here, and they bumped into each other on the street. By random chance. It was raining cats and dogs on that day, and my mother was getting soaked in her thin cotton dress that clung to her body like a wet rag. My father described her as looking so bedraggled that she looked exactly like a drowned kitten. Naturally, being the gentleman he was, he wasted no time in offering her cover and shelter under his umbrella. He then asked her to join him for a coffee. She could not resist the lure of his Russian charm and sexy accent, and so the rest is history. They fell in love and subsequently got married. 2 years later, I was born in Washington State, where I now currently reside. Russians have a reputation for being aggressive, being atrocious drivers, drinking excessive amounts of vodka, saying exactly what they think, and being communists. But not all of those stereotypes are actually true, although the driving one and saying what you think may be. However, I so often get asked by American friends of mine, and especially about the Russian bride stuff, which they tease me relentlessly about. I'm always being told that Russian women infinitely prefer American men. But I promise you, if you walk down the streets of Russia today, you will see many happy Russian couples and women who would never consider looking elsewhere for love. It is true that young people in Russia are exceedingly ambitious and really want to aspire to great and big things. Life is much easier in Russia today than it was in my grandmother's generation. People pretty much have everything these days, especially if they work in the big cities. In my grandmother's day, people were poorer but a whole lot happier and much more satisfied with their lives. It seems as if there is a growing restlessness among the Russian youth today, as if they're searching for something that they just cannot find. The more materialistic they become, the less fulfilled and enriched they feel. This is very noticeable to my grandmother's generation, who watch their children's children with raised eyebrows, secretly wondering if all this exponential growth in materialism has any long-lasting value at all. My Bigfoot encounter happened when I visited my grandmother on my father's side at her home in the Russian countryside. Life in the Russian countryside has really changed over the years. Nowadays, all the young people gravitate towards the main towns like Moscow and St. Petersburg, and more people have left their country villages behind. You can find some villages today feeling like ghost towns, with some homes even being left abandoned. The younger generation love buying houses in the countryside, but it invariably needs to be in close proximity to the main towns and is ideally used as a weekend retreat. The further away you live, the less value your property holds. So in commercial real estate, it truly is a case of location every time, as is the case almost anywhere else in the world. As recently as the early 60s and 70s, those villages were teeming with people who would get up as early as 4 o'clock in the morning to fire up their ovens, as they didn't have any gas connections in those days. The local people needed to eat, so it was something everyone had to do back then. You can only imagine how stifling hot the homes would become in the middle of summer. My gran said you would literally roast like a pig on a spit. People in those days interacted much better than they do today, and everybody knew each other. Nowadays, some Russians in their villages have actually gone to the extent of putting up iron fences around their homes, and sadly, some of them don't even know their neighbours, but this usually happens among the younger generation. The village where my grandmother lives in Russia is very rural and very remote, and is fortunately bustling with activity from the locals who raise turkeys, pigs, chickens, goats, and even cows, and they all grow a lot of their own vegetables, especially tons and tons of potatoes. When I arrived in Russia for a months-long holiday to spend with my grandmother in the Russian countryside, I was 29 at the time, and it was in 2015. I had never met my grandmother in my life, nor had I ever visited Russia before, so I had no idea what to expect about this great country. When I visited her, I was amazed how humble my grandmother's lifestyle was, and how self-sufficient she was, and it rather reminded me of the people in North America who know how to live completely off-grid. My grandmother was elderly, but not in the slightest bit frail. She had meat on her bones and possessed a robust, strong figure. I noticed a limp in her left leg that dragged a little on the ground when she walked. Her weathered, sun-kissed face was dotted with liver spots that were somewhat endearing, as they clearly revealed that life had not always been easy for her. Her rural home was a little run down and faded, and had indeed seen better days. There had been attempts to revitalise the house with a coat of bright pink paint, which did have a brightening effect and really was quite uplifting. She also possessed some really shabby, tired outbuildings where she raises alpine and Anglo-Nubian goats and chickens. Her neighbours raise turkeys and pigs, so the village community actively exchanges their fresh produce among each other, thus enabling greater self-sufficiency. There is a village shop where you can buy all the basics, but the prices there are always spiked, so it's better to do your main shopping in the cities like Moscow or St. Petersburg. However, the village shop is great and it is useful if you need to buy some bellinis or a quick loaf of bread. The rural houses in my grandmother's village are very open without any boundary walls, and the houses blend seamlessly on a never-ending expanse of open countryside that stretches back for miles, with long grasses and pretty wild flowers growing through this open wilderness. It is an intriguing, picturesque world of goats grazing freely, several calves and even flocks of geese dotted around this vast open expanse. One morning after my grandmother had collected a dozen eggs from her chicken coop, she proceeded to make me the Russian staple breakfast of thin lacy pancakes served with thick sour cream and blueberry jam. Although different to our traditional American pancakes, these tasted delicious, and I do strongly recommend trying them. I want to go to the forest today, she told me, to pick up some wild strawberries. Are you going to come with me? Sure, I said. Why not? I did not require much prodding because I adored strawberries, but I had not heard of wild ones before. So armed with plastic buckets, we ventured into the forest. It was a glorious sunny day with a moderate even temperature, and there was a refreshing cool breeze. The forest was full of lots of tall, slender trees with white bark, and its pretty floors were literally covered with wild strawberries that dangled prettily from the green foliage. I squatted down on my 2 legs and popped a strawberry into my mouth, and it was the sweetest, juiciest strawberry I have ever tasted in my entire life, far superior to what you might buy at your grocery store. I started to gather some strawberries in my bucket, and then I got the very strange feeling that something or someone was watching me. I looked around curiously to see if I could see who it was, but there was nobody there. Shrugging my shoulders and telling myself I was imagining things, I continued to pick the fruit. I suddenly noticed that wild strawberries were being flung into my plastic bucket, almost as if an invisible being was helping me gather fruit. It was really peculiar because I could not see who this individual actually was. I then heard the person whistling, and I thought someone was playing a joke on me. But as I surveyed the area, I could see no one there. More and more strawberries were being flung into my bucket, without a single miss. It was like watching balls being aimed at a basketball net, seamlessly, without the ball ever missing the perfect sequence. My grandmother was at the other end of the forest picking strawberries, so I couldn't quiz her about my mystery helper, who was enabling my buckets to explode with huge amounts of strawberries, and was throwing them from far away. I looked up again, and I thought I could see some tree branches moving against the wind, unnaturally, so I knew that the person who was helping me gather fruit was hiding over there. I decided to go over and thank this comical man, whoever they were, for helping me. I could see a touch of red hair blazing brightly through the foliage. I knew that there was no one red-headed in our village, so I was eager to meet this new person, whoever they were. As I approached the tree, I saw a huge creature squatting on the ground, and he was covered from head to toe with red hair, much like that of a red setter or a cocker spaniel. The creature was utterly enormous, and he looked like a huge, big, cuddly teddy bear, although this thing was not a bear, but a humanoid ape-like creature. The strange creature looked up at me in total surprise and studied me curiously with bright, amused-looking brown eyes. I realized the creature was a female because she had breasts covered with fur, and she had very long arms that reminded me of a sloth or orangutan, only they were much more muscular. I noticed the head was cone-shaped, and it blended seamlessly into the shoulders, and if there was a neck, it wasn't clearly visible to me. The long face was pinkish-brown, with a distinctive brow ridge, and a flat, large nose, and a slender mouth. Not once did I detect, not even for a single moment, any animosity from the creature, although she was holding the tree branch and twitching it nervously in her humanoid large hands, almost as if she was a little bit on the shy side. For a moment I locked eyes with this creature, and I rarely sensed her warmth and intelligent demeanour. The creature rose up from the ground, and I noticed that she was extraordinarily tall, at about 8 feet and 600 pounds. As she did this, she kept looking at me, and she started to chatter to me, as if she was talking to me, and she sounded like a monkey. I pointed to the buckets of strawberries, and the creature reached out for a handful like it was a box of popcorn, and then squatted again and started to eat the strawberries. And I sat down and joined her, and we were literally yards apart. It was like something in a dream, sitting down near a huge creature like this, eating wild strawberries on the forest floor. It was a magical moment. Even though we were so different, this special moment brought us together as if we had been lifelong friends. It just felt so natural. Suddenly I heard my grandmother's calls, and I just wanted her to shut up and go away. Why did she have to ruin this moment? Imagine for a second something exciting is happening to you when you're watching your favourite sports team that's scoring a goal, and that's the very second when someone starts nagging you or screaming out your name and robbing you of a second in time that you can never ever get back. It was exactly like that. My grandmother came into view, and I heard her saying, "Oh, there you are!" I heard a rustle and turned around and could see the creature had vanished like a ghost, and I was so utterly disappointed. This unlikely moment spent in a Russian forest was possibly the best moment in my entire life, now cut so unfairly short and sabotaged totally with the appearance of my grandmother, who normally I would have been thrilled to see. My grandmother looked at me strangely. "You look awfully cross," she said. "No, I'm not," I said defensively. My grandmother looked at my buckets of strawberries. "How did you gather so much so fast?" she said. "I need to bring you strawberry picking more often." As we walked back home, I hardly heard a word my grandmother said, as I kept reviewing the memory of my encounter with this powerful, beautiful creature of such a graceful, gentle, warm energy. What was it, I wondered? I'd never seen such an extraordinary creature before, and as far as I knew, there was no creature like this in North America either. It was then that I remembered all the interest in Bigfoot-like creatures on American television. And then I struck pay dirt. Of course, this creature was a Bigfoot. So they were real. I was amazed. I told my grandmother what I'd seen in the forest because I was bursting to tell her about my strange and wonderful encounter with this curious, hairy, humanoid Bigfoot creature. I was almost certain she was not going to believe me, but I was surprised because she did. "You saw the red-headed giant," she said, looking at me aghast, "and you ate strawberries with her? No wonder you looked so cross when you saw me, because I spoilt your sweet little picnic. You are a very lucky girl," she said, "because the hairy giant that lives in the forest is very elusive and keeps himself or herself to himself, and sightings of him or her are few and far between." "How do you know about these creatures?" I asked in surprise. "Well, dear, I've lived here all my life, and those red-headed giants are very gentle creatures, but exceedingly elusive. People have only had sightings of the creature a handful of times, and you come waltzing over here from America and virtually have a picnic with this thing. What have you got that I haven't?" I smiled smugly to myself, knowing that this creature had squatted down with me to eat strawberries was such a privilege. I was thrilled, moved, and touched, to say the least. I wish I could take a photograph of the creature to show my friends in America, because they would never believe that I had seen a Bigfoot. In America, it's known as a Bigfoot or a Sasquatch or even a yeti, and people dream of interactions with this creature. "You'll never get a photograph of the creature," said my grandmother. "People have tried before in Russia, and the photographs end up all fuzzy, because the creatures have a natural cloaking device, so no photograph is going to prove its existence, because it will always appear distorted." "Oh, so you mean the photograph will be so out of focus, so you can never prove you actually saw one?" "Exactly. It'll always be blurred, and people will always question a blurred picture and think you're hiding something." "We did have a Bigfoot upset the locals once," said my grandmother. "It was long before you were born. I was about 8 or 9 at the time. What happened? I asked. It was not the red giant, it was another species. There are different kinds of these creatures, you know. I never saw him myself, but one of the locals did at the time, and said the creature looked like the devil himself. He's dead now, but you can speak to his daughter about it. She'll remember the story. I watched my gran putting the strawberries in a huge pot with water and sugar as she started to cook the jam. I could see the red concoction bubbling like a molten volcano on the stove as I listened to my grandmother continue with her story. I know that was one night the village won't forget. People were shaken up, she said. I gather this creature was huge, covered with black hair and glowing red eyes, and it was seen standing over the pigsty with a massive pig in his hands. People were terrified of this thing. I did go and see the lady in question, and she recounted a story which I will send you in my next letter. Until then, I hope your listeners enjoyed my story. Meeting that female Bigfoot changed my life forever. I am now fascinated by Bigfoots and do as much research as I can, and always go back to Russia to get more insight. I still think of this Bigfoot that I met with so much fondness and love, because she was so gentle and so intelligent, and I consider myself to be one of the luckiest people in the world to have ever met her. I gave her the name Autumn because of her beautiful, shining red hair. Dear Sarah, if you remember in my previous letter, I shared with you my extraordinary experience that I had in a Russian forest. This was where I momentarily interacted and enjoyed a picnic of wild strawberries with a red-haired giant Bigfoot. To date, this quite literally is the most wonderful, profound, and exhilarating experience of my entire young life, and is a memory that will never fade for as long as I live. I truly consider myself to be the luckiest, most privileged person in the entire universe to have had such a profound, phenomenal, intimate, and exquisite encounter with this elusive, hairy humanoid that some like to call Bigfoot, Yeti, or Sasquatch. Truly, I would not swap all the winnings in the world from the National Lottery for that precious, most beautiful moment that I had with this creature, and I relive it again and again in my mind with such joyful recall. I was told by my elderly grandmother at the time, who is a robust, very healthy woman in her late 70s, that when she was a young girl, there was a day when all hell broke loose in the Russian village, and there was one local resident that had a one-on-one interaction with the hairy humanoid. Sadly, this man was deceased, but his elderly daughter was still very much alive, so I went to see her to hear her father's amazing account. In this quaint Russian village, the rustic, very run-of-the-mill looking houses are strategically located pretty close together, but all of them are on substantial plots of land with outhouses that are used for raising farm animals from pigs, geese to goats. I was walking on the large patch of overgrown grass opposite the white gravel road and passing a flock of wild geese on my left-hand side. I then took a left turning into an open courtyard opposite a wood-panelled house that belonged to the old lady that I was about to meet. "Hello there," she said to me in Russian, which I also speak fluently incidentally. "Hi," I replied. "Give me a moment," she said, as I watched her pouring a huge bucket of pig swill into a nearby trough. "They're always hungry," she complained, "but if you have pigs, you have a garbage disposal for life. They're incredibly useful and very intelligent animals, you know." "I know," I said. "I've definitely heard that somewhere." "I'll never be able to turn this one into bacon," she said, pointing to a very large, hefty pig in the corner. "That pig's called Clover. She's like a dog to me. I adore her. Sometimes she comes indoors with me to watch television. That's how good a relationship we have." "Really?" I joked. "What program does she like?" The old woman looked at me through her elderly Arctic blue eyes that were crinkled by her crow's feet, made worse by her thin, fragile skin that was almost translucent. "Oh, she loves the Cooking Channel." "You are kidding, right?" I asked. "No, I'm not," laughed the lady. "Once a pig, always a pig. And if you know a pig, food is never far from their minds." I laughed. This lady was so funny, and I warmed to her immediately. Like my grandmother, she had a very strong, robust figure with pillowy breasts, and she was very short, measuring a tiny 4 feet in height, meaning that I towered above her like a giraffe, even though I'm not that tall myself, but next to her, anyone would feel big. "Come this way," she said, leading me into a spacious kitchen that looked like something out of the Stone Ages, it was so simple. There was a gas hob in the corner, a wood-burning stove for those cold, chilly winter nights, and a small work surface. She gestured for me to sit down on a brown bench next to a very small wooden kitchen table. "Your mother tells me that you want to hear my father's story about the Russian yeti that he encountered that night so many years ago. It is quite some story. It's not a story that I would ever share with anyone else, but I will make you the exception to the rule on this occasion, because your grandmother just happens to be my dearest friend." "Thanks," I said. "I truly appreciate this. Please tell me everything from the very beginning. I've developed an incredible fascination for this creature. A while ago I didn't even believe it existed, but now I most definitely do." "Oh, believe me, it exists," said the lady. She handed me a glass of homemade strawberry cordial, which was utterly delicious, and then she began to tell me her incredible, or his incredible story. "Those were the days," she said. "Oh, it seems like such a long time ago now. I don't think the youth know how lucky they have it these days, because it's so easy for them. In those days, if you didn't work, you quite literally didn't eat. It was as simple as that. Let's get to the story, shall we?" she said, sitting down opposite me with a glass of cordial propped up in her hands. On that winter's day, shortly after Christmas, I think it was snowing outside very heavily, and my father got up at 4 o'clock in the morning to do his usual morning chores. At that time of the morning it was freezing outside, and it was still dark, so he used an oil burner so that he could see clearly. It must have been about -50 or something. It was exceedingly cold, and despite the fact that he was wearing gloves, his fingers were going numb. He could almost barely feel them. He proceeded to stoke up the oven and light the wood-burning stove to warm up the house. Then he went outside to chop some firewood. It was tough work out there, but it always warmed him up, and after that physical exertion, he was a whole lot warmer. Finally, he knew that the animals needed to be fed. That was when he went to the chicken coop, and that's where he noticed a sulphurous odour in the air that was so disgusting he found himself hurling up the previous night's dinner in an empty bucket. After a while, when he had composed himself a bit, he then proceeded to feed the chickens, who appeared to be a little distressed, and to his amazement he found a neat pile of feathers in the corner of the coop, and 2 chicken heads just lying neatly on top of the pile. As you can imagine, my father was floored, because no wild animal makes a neat pile out of its prey, but whatever this thing was, that's what they clearly had done. Using his oil lamp to see clearly, he discovered the most enormous tracks in the snow, but they were utterly peculiar to him because they were human-like and enormous, measuring at least 17 inches, and they appeared to be made by something not wearing any shoes, who had a big toe splayed out to the right, which to my father looked like a strange kind of deformity. It looked like the footsteps had made a long trail all the way from the chicken coop to the far woods, close to the large creek on the left-hand side of the valley. He was amazed because he didn't have any idea what or who this creature could be. He emptied the pig swill into the pig's trough and went back into the house where my mother was bustling around preparing breakfast for him. He sat down and ate some pancakes hungrily with thick sour cream and jam swilled down with a cup of hot coffee, and then he went to sit down to listen to some of his favourite Russian music by the wood-burning stove. At the end of that long day, my parents decided to retire to bed early. My father read me a bedtime story, which is what he always did, and then everyone settled down for the night. It was so freezing that my mother had placed hot water bottles in all our beds to keep our toes nice and warm. It must have been about 1 o'clock in the morning when there was a huge, major commotion going on outside in the animal quarters, and the chickens were squawking and the pigs were oinking incredibly loudly, as if they had been disturbed and as if they were frightened by something. It also sounded like something was out there banging the wooden panels of the outbuildings, and the sound was so loud it reminded me of thunder. My father scurried outside, placing an oil lamp on the ground, which helped to light up the entire area so that he could get good visibility, Then with a large metal pole in his hands, wondering if the thing that had eaten the chickens the previous night had returned again, he wanted to venture closely to see what was going on. And he was not prepared by what he saw. Standing on the outbuilding, 15 feet off the ground, larger than life, was the hugest hairy monster he had ever seen. The body was literally covered with thick black hair from head to foot, with a long stripe of white hair running down its back, in the shape of a lightning strike. My father said the creature was at least 1,000 pounds in weight, and 9 foot tall, with exceedingly long arms and legs, and with human-like feet and hands. My father said the torso of this thing was utterly massive. It had huge, huge shoulders, and it had a bullet-shaped head and a long face, and it had a very big flat nose and very slender mouth. My father said he'd never felt more terrified in his entire life, because this thing glared at him with demonic red eyes that were as red as traffic lights. And then it let out the most terrifying roar that quite literally made my father wobble like a jelly and vibrate. He said that roar was even more terrifying than a lion's. He was so paralyzed by fear that he stood there frozen to the spot like a cement statue. The creature jumped off the outbuilding and lunged towards my father, making the whole ground vibrate. And he had such an aggressive stance that my father suddenly remembered that he had a pole in his hand, and he used it to lash out at the creature. He did manage to hit the creature twice, but he said the creature didn't appear to be hurt in the slightest, even though he lashed out at it as hard as he possibly could, because he knew his life hung in the balance. Instead, it grabbed and seized the pole from my father, almost as if it was a little toy from a child, and turned it around to toss it away, where it went flying over the outbuildings, looking exactly like a javelin. The creature became completely distracted and almost intoxicated, because I think it enjoyed throwing the pole and watching where it landed. And so my father hightailed it back to the house as far as he could in his moment distraction. And he could feel that his legs felt so heavy beneath him. In exhaustion, he bolted the door behind him and sat on the floor for a moment as he tried to regulate his very fast breathing. He then went over to look out of the window, and he could see clearly because in his haste he had left the oil lamp on the ground and not brought it back in. In his horror, he watched this creature, this hairy humanoid with the pole, appearing to play the javelin with it. And he was there for ages playing this javelin. He kept going back to retrieve the pole and throwing it again and again and again, and it appeared like he was chuckling to himself and so enjoying himself. It was the most bizarre thing that my father had ever witnessed in his entire life. The creature, after a long while, began to remember what he was actually there for, and finally my father heard a loud squealing coming from the pigsty, and he knew at once what had happened. And then he saw the massive creature we heard the massive creature making a crashing sound in the pig pen, and then, armed with my father's dead pig in one arm and his new javelin pole in the other, he glided away from our property so fast. My father said that this thing was so graceful and took 6-foot strides and just literally glided to the woods. He'd never seen anything move so magnificently and so fast in his entire life. He was stunned. The next day, 2 or 3 of the villagers did comment that they had seen sightings of this creature overnight and were utterly terrified, asking everyone what they thought they'd seen. One villager had even seen a face peering at her through the window, and she was terrified. No one knew what to do, and my mother said my father suffered from incredible anxiety for a long time afterwards. But the creature did not come back, which was a relief to everyone. My mother reckoned that the creature had just moved on somewhere else. It does seem that there are different species of this kind of creature, because there was a woman in one of the other villages who had an encounter with a very similar creature, but this one was brown.
and I don't know whether she will share her account with you. I hope she will, but I'm not certain. If you like, I'll have a chat with her on your behalf. I would really appreciate that, I said. As you can imagine, I was amazed about the story that I had been told, and very intrigued about this creature that became so caught up in a game of javelin, and I wanted to listen to as many accounts as I could. Fortunately, the other lady had finally agreed to talk to me, so in my third letter I will share her extraordinary account with you and your listeners.
Well, hello there. I hope you enjoyed the omnibus edition. We've got many more coming our way for you to listen to. Sending you love wherever you are in the world, in North America, Canada, Kenya, wherever you may be. I send you lots and lots of love. Thank you for listening to my omnibus, and I really do hope you enjoyed it, because that's the whole idea about it, is to give you some interesting stories to listen to. So until next time, goodbye and good night.